pursue a line of questioning, and I will get to that at some point. But when Jimmy Jordan asked you, why were we in Libya? And I'm not going to ask you the same question because you made it clear you're not the right person for us to ask, and I'm going to respect that. But I want to make sure you understand why Jimmy would ask you that question and why all of us are asked that question with alarming frequency in our districts. The last hearing we had, you did a very good job of explaining to those of us who are not in diplomacy that you have to weigh and balance. I think you said you have to weigh and balance the policy with the risk to determine whether or not you should have a presence. And it just struck me that there's no way you can possibly weigh and balance policy versus risk if you don't understand what the policy is. And then I started thinking when Jimmy was talking, I wonder where the question came from. And I knew I'd seen this somewhere. Do you know someone by the name of Ben Rhodes?
I don't know Ben Rhodes personally. I know the position that he was fulfilling.
I don't know him either, but there was a memo 3 days after 4 of our fellow Americans were killed in Benghazi. And I will skip over goal number 1 of his communications memo. Actually, I won't, because it says to convey that the U.S. is doing everything we can to protect our people and our facilities. And it just struck me, if you really were doing everything you could, we would not have had 50 separate recommendations after you wrote that memo, and this now the second hearing to make sure that those recommendations were implemented. But I'm going to skip over that goal to get to the second goal. The second goal, Secretary Starr, was to underscore that these protests are rooted in an Internet video and not a broader failure of policy. So I'm going to skip over the video part of that for now and get to the second clause, the dependent clause in that sentence, not a broader failure of policy. How can we judge whether or not a policy has failed or succeeded if no one tells us what the policy objectives were? I mean, how can we do that? How can you weigh and balance the risk? Jimmy's gone through the risk. Members on the other side have gone through all the escalating episodes of violence in Benghazi. And it may well be that the reason for us to have been there supersedes all of those episodes of violence. But how? I mean, how can a committee of Congress know that if no one tells us why we were there? So, you're not the right person to ask. Who would you ask if you were us? Who should we bring to explain why were we in Libya?
The policy questions, I think, should more properly be directed to the NEA Bureau, Near East Asia Bureau, that had responsibility.
I'm looking for a name, preferably. I mean, who would be able to tell us what policy we were pursuing in Libya was so important to skip over all the things that Roscoe pointed out and to weigh and balance the episodes of violence in such a way that the presence outweighed the violence?
At the risk of having her never talk to me again, the Assistant Secretary for NEA, Ann Patterson, I think is the highest-ranking person in the NEA Bureau, and at the time of the attack was the U.S. Ambassador in Egypt. And I think Ann or one of the Deputy Assistant Secretaries in the NEA Bureau could give you the best answer on that.
All right. Well, I thank you for that name, and I want to make sure you and I are on the same sheet of music. Do you understand why we would have that question? I mean, do you think that that is a fair and legitimate question for us to ask, what the policy was, so we can then weigh and balance it as you instructed us to do?
I think that's a reasonable question, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now, Secretary Starr, last time you were with us, we not only discussed the most recent ARB recommendations, but we went back and highlighted some from the past. And one in particular from 1999 caught my attention. The Secretary of State should take a personal and active role in carrying out the responsibility for ensuring the security of U.S. diplomatic personnel abroad. It is essential to convey to the entire department that security is one of the highest priorities. And Secretary Starr, just in case somebody missed that part of the 1999 ARB, the authors reiterated that point with this: the Secretary of State should personally review the security situation of embassies and other official premises, closing those which are highly vulnerable and threatened. Two previous ARB recommendations that you could essentially lay on top of one another. They're identical. And I don't think they're identical because they forgot that they put the first one. I think they're identical because they were trying to send a message to us. This is really important, and it is deserving of the attention at the highest levels of the department. So here's what I want to do. I want to ask you, I want to specifically with respect to Benghazi. In October of 2011, there was a specific request for a machine gun to defend our facility in Benghazi. And in August of 2012, just a month before the attack on our facility, a document again lists a machine gun as equipment needed and requested. Do you know who denied the request for those machine guns and why?
No, sir, I do not.
Who should I ask to find out?
You can ask me, sir, and I'll go back and research that.
Would you do that for me?
Yes, I will.
Have you watched the video surveillance from the night of the attack?
I have.
Without going into great detail, would you agree with me, or do you at least see why somebody on the ground might have asked for that piece of equipment, given what you and I have seen in the surveillance video? I mean, thinking back to the video, can you see how that might possibly have come in handy that night?
In my review of what happened and looking at that, I think the agents made the right decisions at that point not to engage. I think that they were equipped with fully automatic weapons, not quite the rate of firepower of a machine gun. I agree that machine guns can be very menacing and have a tremendous effect.
Well, they wanted them for the rooftop. They wanted them for the rooftop. Yeah. I want you to go back, if you would, and watch the video and see whether or not you conclude the same way that I concluded or not. And I appreciate if you could go back and with specificity, I want to know who reviewed that request, who denied that request, and is there an appeals process within the State Department in light of these two previous ARB recommendations that the Secretary of State should take a personal and active review, that the Secretary of State should personally review the security situation? Is there an appeals process where someone hypothetically could say, you know what, you're giving me a no, but I'm going to take this up the food chain? Does that exist?
Yes.
All the way up to the highest levels of the State Department?
I will tell you that the one thing that the Department has that very few other agencies has is something called the dissent channel. And it is a channel that we highly prize, and that if you disagree with policy or you disagree with a decision, that officers in the Department of State at all ranks and all locations have the ability to send something directly in at the highest levels through a dissent channel cable and say, I disagree with something, and it goes to the highest level.
In June and July of 2012, mere months before the attack in Benghazi, the ambassador himself requested a security team be extended to stay longer.
The security team in Tripoli, sir.
In Tripoli, yes, but it doesn't take much to imagine him traveling from Tripoli to Benghazi with an increased security presence, does it? If there are more security folks in Tripoli and he is traveling to Benghazi, it is not that much of a stretch to surmise that some of them may have actually traveled with him.
When he traveled to Benghazi in that trip, sir, he took additional RSOs with him. There were additional RSOs that could have gone as well, but they made
for a grand total of how many?
5 at post.
All right, and how many were there before the footprint was reduced?
3.
No. How many were there before their deployment ended?
I don't think there was ever more than 5 at that post, sir.
In Tripoli?
I'd have to go in Tripoli. I'm sorry, in Benghazi. I'm sorry.
Right. I'm talking about that the ambassador would have had access to, because you and I agree the number that he had access to was reduced despite the fact that he asked for more.
The military team, the SST team, had deported. Additional DS agents were put into post.
All right. Well, what I want you to find out for me is this, because this is a presidentially appointed ambassador who made a pretty plaintive pleading. In fact, I'll quote it to you. Our efforts to normalize security operations have been hindered by a lack of host nation security support, an increase in violence on foreign targets, and neither compound meets OSPP standards. Do you know who said that?
From your context, I would think it would be the ambassador.
It was the ambassador himself in what I would describe as a pretty plaintive pleading for some help. And this is the response he got. No, I do not want them to ask for the team to stay. Do you know who said that to the ambassador, the presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed ambassador?
I believe he was referring to the SST, and that might have been Ambassador Kennedy.
It could have been, but it was actually Charlene Lamb. And Charlene Lamb has not been, and is not likely to ever be the Secretary of State for this country. So when I see her responding to a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed ambassador who is making a pretty plaintive pleading for some extra help, and she says, do not make that request, I want to know whether the ambassador had the ability to go above her head and go straight to the top. And if not, why not?
The ambassador certainly did have the ability to go over her head. Sir, I do think that the one salient point that must be discussed is that there was quite a bit of discussion about relieving the SST, the military team that was there and only provided static security at the compound, with additional diplomatic security agents who could provide static security and mobile security. I think that was why the decision was made to release the SST. We were replacing it with personnel that actually had more capabilities.
Well, Secretary Starr, my time is up, but sometimes when everyone is to blame, no one is to blame. And part of the frustration that Mr. Roscom, I believe, so eloquently remarked on today was the designation of the facility itself. And then you have our heretofore failure to understand what policy would have been so important. You testify that we have how many unpersoned posts right now? 5? Did I hear you correctly? 5? You were going through a series of numbers and you said, well, 5 of those you can discard because there's no one there?
Correct.
So we do close facilities.
Yes, sir.
And I'm assuming that someone did the weighing and balancing in those 5 and decided, you know what, through the miracles of technology or whatever, we don't have to have a physical presence there. So you can understand why we would like to know what weighing and balancing went on with respect to Libya. And I want to know who saw these requests for extra equipment and personnel, who denied them, and whether or not you believe, and Inspector General, you can help here too, whether or not you believe that there is a culture in the State Department where there would be any consequences for following the dissent channel. Because some companies do say, sure, I have an open door policy, but sometimes when you walk through that open door, your career takes a hit. With that, I want to thank the ranking member and all the other members. Thank both of you. You and I can get together privately. You discuss a reasonable time table for getting answers to those questions. And with that, the members would have 5 additional days to put whatever they want. Any questions in the record? Thank both of you for your time. Ms. Starr, in your case, twice. And if you would convey to the women and men who work for the State Department how grateful all of us, irrespective of politics, are for their service. And with that, we would be adjourned.